And welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today is a very special episode. Now, normally we interview filmmakers and film festival organizers and review movies and react to trailers, but today is a bit of a departure. We're actually going to dive into the world of Shakespeare. And this is also a first for us because we have our first British guest on the podcast, Colin David Reese. Sir, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent. And in the email you said that you're in France. Is that correct?
I live in the center of France. Yes.
Okay. What part of France is it? Near Paris or?
No, well, it's about three and a half hours south and west of Paris. It's actually really in the center of France. It's a region which is called Le Berry,
Okay.
which is also called Le Centre de la France, and it's about as far from any border as you can get. And in fact, there is in the village which I live, there is actually a sort of stone indicator saying this is the center of France.
They went out of their way to say that this is the very center of France.
Yeah, so they're very very proud to be in the center. I mean, it's, I bought a built in 1900 farmhouse, which had not been lived in for 5 years, and I'm in the process of turning it into a livable space.
Okay. How long? So how long is that taking you?
Well, I moved here 2 years ago in July, and I suppose I'm probably about 3/4 of the way achieved. I mean, there's still a lot to do, but it keeps me busy and it keeps me young.
Well, I know from experience that that any physical activity that you do is gonna enliven you. So that's perfect. I was gonna say, my family, I do have some family that live over in Lyon. One of my maternal uncles, he actually trained as an artillery officer in France in the, I think, 50s or 60s. Because my family is from Cambodia, which at the time was a francophone country.
Right.
So before the war, they a certain number of them moved to France, and they've been there ever since. And one of my maternal granduncles, he was with the gendarmes. So he worked for them, a little bit after the war, probably like in the 50s, early 50s. And he was pretty much the breadwinner of the entire family. So,
Right.
so I do tip my hat off to the French on that. So today I just want to keep the interview episode simple. I just want to get to know you as a person, and to discuss your show and your channel, Shakespeare Unbound, which is the name of the email that you correspond with. So without any further ado, why don't you introduce us to yourself, or introduce yourself to us, I should say.
Okay. Well, I was born into a theatrical family. My father, Harold Reese, was quite well known when he was a child actor before World War II. And after the war, he mostly moved into doing radio, and he became really quite well known as a radio actor, and that was our family's bread and butter. And so I grew up, and he was passionate, obsessed about Shakespeare, like most British actors, certainly of that era. And so the lingua franca in the in the household when I was growing up was Shakespeare quotes. And so, if you wanted somebody to pass the butter at the dinner table, you would try and find a Shakespeare quote that corresponded. So my connection with Shakespeare is from a very, very young age. At the age of 12, I was cast in a comedy musical tryout, which actually never went anywhere, but that's the way of things. As Shakespeare's illegitimate son, in because the setting was the inn in Windsor, which is perceived to have been possibly the halfway house between London and Stratford, and so where he would possibly have stayed. And the play The Merry Wives of Windsor is kind of this musical was based around this inn in Windsor, and according to the play, Shakespeare had a mistress which he would visit, and when he went to this inn, and he had a son, and I in this musical I played the son, and so and then all through my teenage years, I got more and more into Shakespeare, and got to know more and more of the plays partly by reading them, and also partly because my father being on the radio repertory, BBC Radio Rep, they would produce live on radio 2 plays a week, one on Wednesday and one on Saturday, and they would do all sorts of plays, from Chekhov to some new plays, and including Shakespeare. And of course, it was part of the family duty to sit around the radio every Wednesday and every Saturday and listen to Father on the radio. So I mean, this was not an option, and of course, over the years, 2 plays a week, that covers quite a lot, and there were quite a lot of Shakespeare. And so by the time I was, I guess, into my early 20s, I knew, even if I hadn't studied them, I knew practically all of Shakespeare's plays from having listened to them on the radio. And so, and then in 1973, I went to Webber Douglas Academy Drama School. I was a little bit older than most of the students. I was 23, and Webber Douglas is absolute classical training, in the sort of mold of the French Conservatoire, and of course Shakespeare was extremely present in the curriculum there. So my this reinforced more and more my knowledge and passion with Shakespeare. Somebody once asked me the other day, well, a couple of years ago, are you passionate about Shakespeare? I said, no, I'm obsessed. And that obsession has never left me. In the mid-80s, I got a grant from the Greater London Council, which was extremely left-wing at the time, to provide a show for taking Shakespeare to working class areas, to making Shakespeare accessible to people who would not normally have had access to Shakespeare or possibly and probably never have seen a Shakespeare play or even contemplated the idea. And the budget was not enormous, so it had to be a low cast. We didn't have you know a budget for a cast of dozens. So and in fact, it was really only the budget was really only big enough, 2 people and a stage manager. And the brief was to take Shakespeare into community centres and working men's clubs, and so we had to build a set which would be transportable, and come up with a program which would be accessible to people who had never seen Shakespeare performed.
So let me ask
And
you. Sorry to interrupt, but so let me ask you this. So in terms of the budget, how much are we talking at that time?
84, I can't remember. Enough to pay 2 actors and a stage manager, build the set, costumes, for a 6-week tour.
Okay.
Equity minimum. I mean, and so no, I have absolutely no recollection of what that came out to in terms of figures.
But it was pretty modest, I imagine.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, not like the sort of budget that the Royal Shakespeare Company would be able to put together.
Oh yeah,
And so 2 actors. So what can we do? 2 actors, set. And so I thought about it, and I discussed it with my father quite a lot. And I thought, father, son, okay.
seems appropriate.
Yeah, and he didn't really fancy the idea of getting into a car and driving to some working class area and setting up the set and the lights and so on. He felt he was a little bit beyond that. So I've got a universal theme, love. So we thought about it, and we thought, okay, now there are lots of love scenes in Shakespeare. I mean, obviously, Romeo and Juliet and so on. And so we decided on 2 handlers, love scenes, man and a woman. Let's have a look at what's available. So between us, we sat down and we said, oh, this scene's good, this scene's good, this scene's good, this scene's good. And we ended up with about 9 hours of material, which was obviously not going to be possible. So we had to bring it down to about 1 hour. It had to be about 1 hour, 1 hour 10. And so I think we ended up with Romeo and Juliet, Catherine and Petruchio, Ferdinand and Isabella, Beatrice and Benedict, and then to give it some spice, Angelo and Isabella, which is not exactly a love scene, but it's very much a sort of Harvey Weinstein moment, where he says, if you'll sleep with me, I'll pardon your brother, and if you don't, I'll not only kill him, I'll torture him as well. And then the Macbeth, and then finishing it off with Pyramus and Thisbe from
Midsummer Nights.
A Midsummer Night's Dream. And so I found an actress and who could handle all those parts, because that's a pretty wide range. And we started rehearsing. And one of the things that struck me while we were rehearsing was how all these scenes seem to be little playlets in their own. I mean, if you took a whole arbitrary set of scenes from, I don't know, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, or you know, they wouldn't make any sense. But these scenes had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you know, if you have this love scene between Romeo and Juliet, you really don't need to know the context and of who Romeo is and who Juliet is in order to be able, in order for the little scene to hang together. And this intrigued, this really intrigued me, and I thought more and more about it. And I started to do some research, and I came up with something which is really quite fundamental. We talk about late 16th, late Elizabethan Jacobean theatre. The period is known as early modern, which is a historical period. But when you apply it to dramatic literature, it's misleading, because early modern implies that it's the beginning of what we now know as, whereas in fact it was the end of a 4th century development of dramatic art, of performance, and the reason why these scenes kind of worked as scenes isolated from the rest of the play is because the dramatic art of writing of plays at that period came out of a tradition known as the interludes. And the interludes were short playlets around a theme, which were performed by the players in between the courses at a banquet. So the lord of the manor, or even the monarch, would set up a banquet, and the players would be employed to come out, perform a scene. Then there would be the first course of the banquet, and then the players would come out and perform another scene, and then there would be the next course in the banquet, and the whole evening obviously would go on for many hours. But that idea, that concept of a scene being complete in and of itself, comes from there. And so that really set me off onto more and more research, and I started to get even more fascinated about the idea of how did the players work? What were the original practices? How did the players actually function? And I did more research, and I discovered that there are a series of documents in a basement in a school called Dulwich College in South London, which was actually founded by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, an actor called Edward Alleyne. And Edward Alleyne was the son-in-law of the biggest theatre impresario of the time, Philip Henslowe. And in the mid-19th century, they were rummaging around in the basement of the school. The school's still there. The shock horror scandal is they now accept girls, but they never used to. It's a private school. And they came across this trunk, and in this trunk was a whole series of documents, which are now known in the academic world as Henslowe's papers, which were papers from late 16th, early 17th century theatre, which had been put into this trunk, and the trunk had never been opened until 1860, 1870, something like that. And there were all sorts of documents, including financial records, detailing every play, every performance, how much, what the performance was, what the box office take was, etc. And you're looking at that, you realize quite how much money they were making. I mean, it was huge. I mean, it was not quite Hollywood blockbuster, but I mean, it was pretty high rock musician, rock concert type incomes, and the first thing I noticed, was that they did a different play every day. No play was ever performed on 2 days consecutive. And now you have to remember that everything was handwritten. There was no Gustetta machines or photocopies, so everything was written out by hand.
So they didn't take it to the printers to try to make multiple copies of them, because the printing press had been around by that time.
Yeah, but printing was enormously expensive and incredibly incredibly labor intensive, and you wouldn't print a play just for the 25 players who are going to be performing it. You'd only print it when it had success in the playhouse, and you could probably make money by selling it because it had been successful in the playhouse.
So, like, when you get the folios later on, correct?
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. So everything is written by hand. Well, if you're going to write everything out by hand, I mean, if you're going you take the play of Romeo and Juliet, nobody is going to sit down and write the entire play of Romeo and Juliet for every single character that is in the play. So what you get are what are called cue scripts. If you're a player, you get your lines and a cue. A cue to action, which is the origin of the word cue. And that's in fact if you think about it in billiards, that's what the cue does. It spurs the ball into action. And and so you got this you got this roll of paper, if you were playing Romeo, for example, on which were your cues and your lines. And in this collection of papers that was in Henslow Papers in Dulwich College was a cue script, not unfortunately for Shakespeare. And wait a minute. You don't have access to the entire play. You're doing a different play every day. Like, when do you rehearse? Well, you don't. I mean, no. I mean, when would you rehearse? Certainly not in the sense of, as we understand rehearsing, going into them. So there is one other element which was in the trunk, in the box, which was a cue script. And I looked at the cue script, and now I had done a little bit of research into Commedia dell'arte, not a lot, just, sort of. And I realized, looking at this cue script, that it followed the format exactly of the Commedia dell'arte cue scripts, which, of course, the Commedia dell'arte plays were improvised. And so basically what you got excuse me, what you got in the Commedia in the cue script in the these are called plot sheets. What you got on the plot sheet was enter king, enter king and queen, to them prince.
Colin, you there?
Etc. I mean, and that's all you got. But that was it was very big. It's about what we would now consider to be A3. And it was printed on, and it was handwritten, obviously, on card, and had a and it had a square hole in it. And so obviously there was a sort of piece of wood peg, and they put this plot sheet up backstage so that everybody in the tiring house, so that everybody could have a look at it and I'll say, okay, I'm in Act 2, Scene 3. Okay, right, yes. So that's what I do. So that's what I say. And so now you know what you say, and you know when you come on, and that's all you know. What the other actors are going to say, what the other characters are going to say, you don't know. All you know is about 3 or 4 words of the end of their speech. And I just said to myself as a performer, how in God's name is this possible? And I realized, of course, the plot sheet bearing such a resemblance to the plot sheets of the Commedia dell'arte is they must have used Commedia dell'arte performance techniques. They had to be very careful about what they said, because there was at that time the Lord Chamberlain's office who had to license a play, and in order to license the play they had to read it. So the play would, handwritten copy again, would be sent to the Lord Chamberlain's office, and it would come back from the Lord Chamberlain's office with emendations, things crossed out, but a license. And you could not perform a play on stage which did not have the Lord Chamberlain's seal of approval and license. And just as an aside, that situation existed and continued in the UK up until 1968.
Oh, wow.
You could not perform a play on stage without having a license from the Lord Chamberlain's office. And for those of a certain age, Hair was the first public performance of a play or musical which had not had a license. And of course it had full nudity. Shock, horror, scandal.
Now, so I want to ask, so why was it so important for the Lord Chamberlain to sign off on these plays? Was it for political reasons or
politics and public morality as well?
Okay, so they didn't want something too raunchy that would scandalize the public, right?
Yeah. I mean, they wanted to maintain public morality, and I mean, even up until 1968, I mean, certain words like the F word were not allowed on stage. Yeah, so the Lord Chamberlain, certainly in Elizabeth's time, I mean, politics was. I mean, plays were enormously successful and enormously popular, and therefore politically, potentially very powerful.
Yeah, like Richard II, for instance. I mean, I remember. I mean, Elizabeth was pretty conscious of the fact that people could get the wrong idea if they saw Richard II. For example.
Well, I deal with that in quite a lot of detail in Shakespeare Unbound.
Okay.
and the story of what happened, and yes, then well, no, I don't want to give a spoiler, but uh, uh, they were lucky to get away with it and not end up in the tower.
Right.
Um, because there is a long story as to why they performed Richard II and why Elizabeth was, because it had been licensed, it had been around for when they resuscitated it because they were well. You have to watch the show. I mean, it's,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I
anyway,
also saw a documentary about that too. So
right. And so going back to me and my my voyage on this was, I went, how in God's name was this possible? Okay, so commedia dell'arte, fine, but that can only take you so far because you're working with written text, and you cannot improvise that written text. If you say anything that has not been approved by the Lord Chamberlain, you are in big trouble. And this is where I started to have shivers down my spine and the genius of Shakespeare. I mean, I had always been impressed with Shakespeare and passionate to the point of an obsession. But it's then I realized the only way this works is because it's actually encoded into the writing. And the way Shakespeare uses and manipulates the iambic pentameter gives everything you need to know as a player on how to perform that speech or how to play that character, and that is encoded into the text. And his capacity to manipulate syntax, linguistic structure, and just language in general, is the musical score for the player. And if you ignore the verse, you ignore it at your peril, because it becomes an intellectual masturbation rather than it would be like playing Mozart and saying, well, I don't want to respect the bars.
right, because then it loses all meaning.
Yeah. And so since then, I have spent probably the third section of my life studying speeches and looking at them from the point of view of how has he manipulated the verse, and what does this actually, what does it mean, but in a very visceral sense of what it means, not in an intellectual sense, but in a working on the level of the emotions and the passion, rather than what it means in terms of an intellectual understanding. So yeah, I think that just about covers my journey.
Wow, that is a very, very fascinating journey right there. So I did want to ask you. So when you're talking about about how Shakespeare manipulates language. How does one approach that? Because from an academic standpoint, when we're looking at Shakespeare, we're just understanding it, from a contextual standpoint. Like,
Right.
obviously he's writing this because at that time they were having to deal with rebellions and plots and all that stuff.
Mhm.
Is it something similar to that, or are you looking at it
No,
more from a linguistic standpoint?
no, I'm looking at it straight from a performance point of view.
Okay, can you dive a little bit more into
Yeah,
that?
let's take the most famous line in Shakespeare, and possibly the most famous line in the whole of English literature. I hate calling dramatic art literature because but that's another podcast. To be or not to be, that
Yeah.
to be or not to be, that is the question. Okay, now it's written within the format of iambic pentameter, so you have to be or not to be, that is the question. Well, he could have written the question is the question is to be or not to be,
Right.
which is also iambic pentameter. Now, if you take the line that he actually did write, to be or not to be, that is the question, you have the 5 beats. You also have what is, some people call it a feminine ending. I personally prefer to call it an open ending. That little 11th beat, which falls on the end of the line.
Mm-hmm.
Now, each of the 5 beats, and and this is what I spend all the time. I'm not chopping wood or looking after the dogs doing. Is taking speeches which I've never seen, never read before, and subjecting them to this process. If you take the 5 beats, to be or not to be, that is the question. Now, each of the 5 beats in a Shakespeare line, particularly if it's in iambic pentameter, in perfect iambic pentameter, give or take an open ending, each of the 5 beats has a function. The first is to introduce, the second is to either reinforce or contradict. The third is the middle beat of the line, so it's kind of the fulcrum point, it's the balance point of the line.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth is there to introduce the most important word in the line, which is the last word. Now, one of the first exercises that I do whenever I take a speech which I've not seen before, or even ones I do know but I'm re-looking at, is to go down the speech and look at all the last words of the lines, and that gives you a very general idea of what the speech is about. And then subject each line to this regularization of the 5 beats. To be or not to be, that is the question. Now, the first thing we get is that the first line ends with the word question, so the word question is going to hang over the whole speech, which is what the speech is about. Some people say it's about it's an existential examining of one's mortality or whatever, but actually it's not. It's about question. It's about question, and that is in fact, I mean, if you take the rest of the play, that is Hamlet's great tragedy. He's forever questioning. And rather than acting, acting in the sense of actually doing something, he forever questioning. Now, if you take the alternative way that I put that, the question is to be or not to be, then you have the last word is be, and so the word be will hang over the speech, but that's not the way Shakespeare wrote it. Shakespeare wrote it with the word question being at the end. And if you look at it, the to be or not to be, that is the question. It's in terms of syntax, that's kind of not how we really speak. In fact, the question is to be or not to be would probably be much more colloquial. But and so to be or not to be, that is the question. And so you have the word is falling on not only a strong beat, but the fourth beat. And as I said, the fourth beat is there to introduce the fifth being the most important. So it's if you say it and you emphasize, not overly, but you emphasize that is to be or not to be, that is the question. And suddenly that line takes on a whole different meaning from a performance point of view. I'm talking not from an intellectual study point of view. That is the question. And we do stress conjunctions and there's an example I use. I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk, which is perfect iambic pentameter, and it's very much the way we speak. But if you subject it to my 5 rules, I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk. So you've got a conjunction, and the conjunction and has fallen on the third beat, being the middle of the line. Now, I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk is a very banal statement. I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk.
Mm-hmm.
If you stress the and, as an actor, you have the sense that there is some sort of backstory going on here. Yeah. Last time when I asked you for some coffee, you didn't bring me the bloody milk. So, don't forget it this time.
Right.
Or whatever. I mean, the fact of putting the and in the middle of the line and on a strong beat. You see, I stressed and there. Are indications to the performer. And this is, I mean, I have a musicologist who is a friend who is feels the same about Mozart as I feel about Shakespeare, and she said she spent her entire life studying Mozart, and she says I never cease to marvel at the incredible musicology behind Mozart. Now, as a 6-year-old boy, was he a genius at musicology? No, but he just felt it. He knew it. It was his. It was his genius, and the same is true about Shakespeare. I feel. Now, if you take that line, to be or not to be, that to be or not to be, that is the question. And we've got that 11th beat, that open ending. Now, if you look at the next line, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer, it starts with a trochee. You could not say whether. It has to be whether. So you've got a line which is finished with an open ending. And so the next line starts with a trochee. And I've looked at now thousands of Shakespeare's lines which have open endings. And probably about 90% of the time when he has a line which finishes with an open ending, the following line starts with either a trochee or a spondee. And helps to break up the ti-tum, 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 because but it also gives a continuity, because you've got to be or not to be, that is the question, whether to noble, so that you have a weak strong which is running over the end of the line, even though there is full stop after question. That sense of titum is actually running over the end of the line, and so it gives continuity, and hence the musicality. You asked for one example. That's one.
Well, yeah, I remember because I remember in college when I took a literature course, and we were studying the sonnets. We weren't studying the plays, but I remember the professor pretty much emphasizing very briefly what you just explained there. But he did mention that Shakespeare usually started off with he would go in a pattern of stress, unstressed, stress, and he would always end with a stressed vowel. Is that like a valid way of looking at that, or?
Well, our sonnets kind of different, because although they were most poetry, even in that time, was written to be read out loud, but it wasn't dramatic verse. Although there is a great deal of drama, both in the sonnets and even more in Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. It is poetry, and the plays are not poetry. The plays are dramatic verse, and I think that one should always make the distinction between the two.
Okay. So when looking at poetry, you're going to look at it from a different lens than, say, when you're looking at the plays, because the plays are, I guess you could say the plays there's a more active, I guess, an active context, because they're being performed, whereas with the poems and sonnets, they're going to be more passive, because you're naturally reading them, even if you are reading them out loud.
Yeah. I mean, poetry generally was created to be read in a salon. The poet himself perhaps would stand up in front of the ladies, and mostly ladies, and read the sonnets.
Okay, gotcha.
Read the poems.
Yeah, because it's always been more of a private affair, as opposed to plays, which are more public and out in the open. Okay.
But there was, having said that, there was the poems and the sonnets were printed very much earlier than the plays. In fact, there was a great reluctance to print the plays. Yes, you talked about the folio, which brings
yeah, I was actually going to bring that up.
Which brings me to the folio. Shakespeare died in 1616. The folio was printed in 1623. When Shakespeare died, only about 18 of the plays had actually been printed. Some of them in copies, which were some of the in quarto versions. Quarto would be like a paperback. A folio is huge book, sort of like a modern encyclopedia, and in terms of size, and only I think 18 of the plays had been printed in quarto version, and some of the quarto versions were not official, and were we still have them, and were almost certainly pirated, in that a hired man, perhaps, who had played one or two of the characters, went to a printer and said, "Look, I mean, that play, Timing of Athens, which everybody is loving. I can get you a printed. We can print a version of it and sell it on the book stands in St. Paul's Churchyard, and we can make a lot of money." And so the resultant quarto was somewhat bastardized version of the play, because he was working from his memory of what had gone on stage.
So he didn't actually. So they didn't actually have like the lines or anything in front of them. They were just going off memory.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what we can pretty much surmise now from some of the quartos. Some of the quartos were official. I mean, there's the famous. There are two different quartos of Hamlet. There's the first quarto and the second quarto, and so there are actually three versions of Hamlet. There's the first quarto, which is a bastardized version. There's the second quarto, which was supervised and overseen by the Chamberlain's men, or the King's men, actually, I think, by that time. And then there's the folio version. They're all three really quite different. Some of the scenes are in different order, and what you get in any edited version, edited by an academic, and I'll get to the academics in a minute, is usually an amalgam of all three versions. And so the whole thing, if you do the whole thing as printed in any edited version, it lasts about 5 hours, and there is no way that any play given the terms and conditions and working practices of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, there's no way a play could have lasted 5 hours. So my personal feeling is that the first quarto was yes, some scholars have isolated which characters and there were probably two, which characters the two players played. Marcellus, I can't remember the others. Any research will show that up. The second quarter was authorized, and the folio version is different again from the second quarter. Given the time scale, I think there were quite obviously possibly rewrites. I mean, if you've ever, I mean, every film screenwriter will say, they get to draft 75 before they even get to one that is workable.
Right.
So I don't think the idea of rewriting was unknown in that period.
I mean that does make sense. So my other question is, because I'm someone who enjoys reading Shakespeare. I've made it a point to try to collect as many Shakespeare plays from a certain publisher as I could. How do I know, for example, that the Oxford World Classics edition of Henry IV Part 1 is genuine and it's not based on the other quartos that may or may not have characters that aren't supposed to be in there, or lines that aren't supposed to be in there?
Right. What scholars do to Shakespeare? Interesting that you should bring that up, because I'm talking to a scholar at the moment, and we're talking about setting up an online debate, how the scholar and how the player approaches Shakespeare. What are their differences? Where do they overlap? And how can they complement each other rather than be at odds with each other? Because to answer your question, if it's any respected academic print house, Cambridge or Oxford, then you could be fairly sure, except that because scholars don't understand a lot of the choices in the way the verse is laid out, they make what I personally consider to be incorrect choices, incorrect assumptions and choices, particularly in lineage, the way it's lined. And I found some glaring well, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio has this long speech. Ah, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you, with thee. She is the fairest midwife. She comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone. And now I have a copy of a facsimile, not a copy, of the first folio. And in every edited version I found, it's been versified. Whereas in the folio, it's in prose. Up until about 2 or 3 lines before Romeo interjects, and then it switches into verse. Now, as a player, I understand. And having, because I always do it. I mean, it's just, it's all very well to think about it and to talk about it, but you have to do it. And I always do it. And in fact, that Mercutio speech is wonderful, because when there is a complete shift when he goes into verse. Hello?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm here.
Yeah. And so why has every scholar who has prepared an edited version of Romeo and Juliet gone through the effort, because it's actually not easy. You have to reline it. If you look at it in the folio, I mean, to take the speech as it's laid out in the folio, and look at it and compare it to the way it's laid out in every edited version. I mean, there's an awful lot of work that's gone in to versifying it. And it's very frustrating as a performer, because versified, it's actually extremely difficult to play. Whereas if you do it in prose, it flows. It's incredibly poetic. It's incredibly full. It's full of the most amazing imagery, but it's not in verse.
So basically, so it sounds like what the scholars are doing is they're just taking something that's not supposed to be in verse and try to make it fit into that mold, because they feel that's how Shakespeare would have wanted it. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, yes. I'm not going to go into the assumptions of what goes on in the minds of scholars, because and that's why we are talking, John and I are talking about putting this debate together, because very often um, we're at odds, us the players and the scholars, because our approach is so different.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I mean, if you take it down to its absolute very basic, the scholar will say, "What does it mean?" And the player will say, "How does it feel?"
Yeah, because because obviously, from a scholarly point of view, they're not. I mean, at least that I know, they're not going to step out onto the stage and perform it the way that an actor would. So they're
Mhm.
comfortable. They're comfortable approaching it from an intellectual standpoint, trying to understand the history, the psychology. Whereas an actor is going to feel for the flow of those lines.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to ask you about your about your show Shakespeare Unbound. What do you? It's gonna sound like a dumb question, but what do you cover on your show? Do you cover the do you I'm assuming you go into Shakespeare quite a lot, but do you cover your analysis of those lines in detail very very well, or Colin, are you there? It appears Colin has dropped off. Let me see if I can get him back on here. Um, I guess while we're waiting for Colin to come back, I did want to say that this approach to Shakespeare from a performer standpoint, actually does make sense because the Shakespearean plays have always been meant to be performed, and I think where we kind of, at least in my perspective, where we've sort of fallen off is the fact that we've reduced it to a literary intellectual exercise, and in a way, it's sort of the easier route, but it also does Shakespeare a huge disservice because we lose the flow, we lose the meaning, we lose the emphasis that that Shakespeare puts in his lines. So just as Colin said earlier about that famous speech from Hamlet, "To be or not to be," when we read it, it kind of goes over our heads because we're thinking about what's going on in Hamlet's mind. Is he contemplating something serious? Is he doing this or is he doing that? But from a performer standpoint, as you said before, there's a bit of a story to it because if you're saying that is the question, it sort of creates this realization that maybe this thing that's been rattling my head, maybe there's something to it. Um, that's my takeaway from this entire from that approach to understanding those lines, and it's a very fascinating approach, I think. um let's see if we can get Colin back on here. I sent the invite back. Let me see if I can get him. back. But we'll see. We'll see what we can do to get Colin back on the podcast. But while we're doing that, let me know down in the comments what you think of Shakespeare. Let me know if there are certain approaches that you feel work for you when trying to understand the Bard and his work. And also remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think. I would definitely love to get more guests onto the show, and definitely love to grow the podcast as well as the audience base for the channel. I'm gonna include links for Colin's channel. Let's see if I can find any links for his show, as well as anything in terms of his social media profile or sites. I will put that down the link as well, because this is a very fascinating topic for me. And it's something that I would definitely love to expand upon on the podcast in future episodes. And I guess the big question for me is which publisher gets Shakespeare correct the most, because over the years I've tried collecting different publishers just to see if there's a bit of a difference. I did mention the Oxford World Classics. I've got Hamlet and Henry IV Part 1, and Pelican Shakespeare. At least in my younger days, it was sort of a go-to for me. But I've started looking at other publishers like Arden. I believe RSC has several copies out as well. I think I've got the RSC copy of Richard III, and then I've got the Arden copy of Richard II. So hopefully that'll be a future episode where I can ask Colin if there is if there's a particular publisher that he would recommend. I will say I've never been a fan of the Folger library versions of Shakespeare. If you went to school in the late 90s, early 2000s, I know the Folger copy was the copy that every student had to get when they were reading Shakespeare. I know I had to get it for Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet. There was one other one. I think it might have been Midsummer Night's Dream, although I cheated a little bit and I got the Signet Classic version instead. But all the lines seem to be there. So we'll just wait to see if we can get Colin back on here, and if not, we'll go ahead and end the episode. But like I said, I mean, from this is a huge shift for the podcast, because previously we've always, like I said before, we've always done movie reviews, trailer reactions, give our opinions on certain topics, certain movies, as well as interview filmmakers and producers and film festival organizers. So I feel like by doing this particular episode, it kind of opens up the doors to include different perspectives, not only on on the arts, but also different segments within the performing community. Just because Shakespeare has always been such a huge influence on the public imagination. I know in the UK, Shakespeare has a much stronger presence because of the fact that the Bard is English, but it's also had a huge influence on the way that people around the world have always understood and appreciated Shakespeare. In terms of what he says, how he conveys our hopes, fears, and understanding of the human condition. Oh, there you go. There you are. Colin, can you hear
Right.
me?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what happened. I don't have very good internet connection. I have a 4G thingy, and sometimes I don't know, bird flies in front of the transmitter or something. But I will get fiber optic before the end of the year, according to the mayor. Um,
So
and- so
um,
anyway, I was
yeah,
I was just saying, if I can pick up where I was, academics and what they can bring. I was talking to my scholar friend and talking about the to be or not to be speech, and he said something which I didn't know, which kind of only a scholar would know. There's the line when he would his quietest make with a bare bodkin, and 99% of people interpret that as stabbing yourself with a dagger, bodkin.
right.
But he, having done quite a lot of research into early modern literature, so there is absolutely no example of the word quietus being used in terms of committing suicide. In fact, it is getting quietus is getting revenge,
Oh, okay.
which changes that whole line entirely.
Which makes sense given the nature of the play.
Yeah, yeah. Why would I suffer all this when I could get revenge with a simple dagger?
That changes the trajectory right away because
Yeah,
because I was always told that if you read the line, it's basically about Hamlet, having to decide, should I just kill myself because there's just so much going on.
yeah,
But that kind of doesn't make any sense if the whole play is about trying to get revenge.
yeah. And you add that to what I can bring, i.e., the fact that the whole speech is about question and not about an existential self-analysis. So the question is, do I kill the bastard as revenge?
Just get rid of Claudius, just off him.
Yeah, yeah. And that, as I say, that, and so that is a wonderful example of how the player can bring to the scholar something by saying, look, it's not about to be or not to be, it's about question. And the scholar can bring something to the player saying, look, it's not about doing oneself self-harm. Quietus is about getting revenge.
Good Lord. How many more Shakespeare plays have we misinterpreted?
So that I mean, well, the work that I do on the speeches, on analyzing the speeches in terms of the iambic pentameter is I'm forever going, holy shit, that's what it means. Yeah.
So so my favorite speech out of Shakespeare is the St. Crispin's Day speech.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously when I look at it, it's basically Henry saying, I would rather have you guys here, the guys who are actually here and willing to do the fighting, than any other army in the world, and all the people in England who are just living their lives away. Screw them. I don't need them. I got you guys here. I mean, is there a different layer to that speech altogether, just based on what we're looking at here?
I would need to go through it because it's not one I've actually analyzed. It's a bit of an aria, I think. Also, yeah, it's a an aria in operatic terms, and that depends on, and of course, a lot of it depends on how it's performed. An actor I saw performing it. I do hate trashing other actors by name.
Was it just out of curiosity? Was it part of the Hollow Crown series? Because if it is, I think I know who you're talking about.
No, it was at the Globe.
Oh, okay.
And there was one actor I saw perform it, and it was so low energy and so low key. And I thought, well, if I'd been there in the army, I would have taken the bag of gold and gone back to England, because if that's the guy who's going to lead me, then it doesn't give much confidence.
I mean, because we're talking about the night before Agincourt, so obviously you're going to want a high energy speech to kind of get you pumped up, because you're an undersized army, you're going against a much larger French army that's better equipped and more motivated than your little band of raiders, I should say.
Brothers.
We band of brothers.
We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? As how does it read? How does it play? My favorite speech is "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I," which is an extremely long speech. And the reason why it's my favorite is because of the way Shakespeare plays with the iambic pentameter, and buggers around with it in enormous and making it extremely difficult to retain the iambic pentameter in some points, and then others it's quite easy. And the way the whole speech is orchestrated, the way it's structured, the way it's built, you start off with 3, 4, 5 lines which are perfect iambic pentameter. "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I! Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction and a dream of passion, could force his soul so into his own conceit that from its working all his visage one," etc. And it's perfect iambic pentameter. And then as he gets more and more agitated, the iambic pentameter starts to break apart. There are several lines where you just simply cannot maintain it. And he starts to introduce more and more midline endings. And now one of my rules is that you don't breathe in the middle of a line. So if you have a full stop in the middle of a line, you finish the sentence and start the new sentence coming straight away.
Right.
And so the midline endings, and the way those midline endings are structured, because they sometimes said just before the fourth beat, and then they get just before the third beat, and then they get earlier and earlier, and the whole sense of breathlessness takes place, and then suddenly, bang, you have a short line for Hecuba. And a short line means you then have 4 beats as a pause. And then the iambic pentameter comes back. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? What would he do had he the motive and the cue for prayer? And so the iambic pentameter comes back, and it accelerates by the use of the midline endings, and it accelerates until you get to another short line. "Oh, vengeance." And then what comes in afterwards is perfect iambic pentameter, and then he gets himself all worked up again. And I mean, the way that speech is structured is so brilliant, because if you just follow or try to follow and fail the iambic pentameter, everything is done for you.
Wow. And that's fascinating too, because the way that it's structured, it kind of builds up to a crescendo, it kind of builds up to the point where agitation takes over, and then when the iambic pentameter returns, it's like you return to that calm, normal state.
Yeah,
that's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, it's and then you take, for example, another example of the use of verse or iambic pentameter and not is Brutus's speech to the plebeians after having dispatched Caesar, and it's all rational and it's prose,
Right.
and then Mark Antony gets up and it's verse. Now, Mark Antony's speech is perfect iambic pentameter, not one midline ending in the whole, well, apart from one right at the beginning, not one midline ending. Every full stop is at the end of the line. And there are a shitload of lines which end with ambitious. And Mark Antony's speech is in verse. It is perfect iambic pentameter. It is pure rhetoric, and it is designed to work on the visceral passion. Whereas Brutus's speech in prose was intended to work on the rational. And the juxtaposition of those two speeches is extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely, because Brutus is trying to justify his actions, whereas Antony is trying to say, well, that's not the full story you're getting here.
Yeah.
I mean, also with that speech, I kind of get the feeling that Antony's being a bit sarcastic as well.
Oh, hugely.
Because he keeps emphasizing, and Brutus is an honorable man. It's like he's standing there.
And again, and Brutus is an honorable man.
He's emphasizing the is. Yeah.
The is falls on a strong beat, and Brutus is an honorable man. Which again, if you stress the is, the sarcasm drips off. Whereas if you just say, and Brutus is an honorable man, it doesn't have anywhere near the power. Right. And all those, and so are they all honorable men. It's the second all that falls on the strong beat.
Right. So he's just twisting the dagger and just saying, yeah, they really are a great bunch of guys.
Aren't they? Yeah.
They really are looking out for you by killing Caesar. Mm-hmm. And then obviously we know what happens after that. The crowd gets worked up, and then they go after the senators.
Yeah. But I mean, it's brilliant, and again, the structure and the use of and the way the words that you would not intellectually think fall on strong beats. I mean, that particular one, and Brutus is an honorable man. He has said so. Mark Antony has said nothing except that stressing that is says everything.
And I was going to say too, because if you're in the audience and you're listening to that, instinctively you kind of start to second guess what Brutus is saying. But if you're just reading it, it's like, oh well, it's just another speech. But when you actually listen to it, you're like, yeah, maybe he isn't such a great guy after all,
Yeah, without actually saying anything.
So basically, we're overthinking it.
He says absolutely nothing against Brutus. It's
Right.
just the way it's phrased, and the way it is phrased has been done by Shakespeare by putting certain words that you would not intellectually consider to be important onto strong beats. In fact, if you look on my YouTube channel, you will see that there is a clip from Shakespeare Unbound of John Hemmings doing the Mark Antony speech, and you'll see what I mean.
Yep, I've got it. I've got it pulled up here. I'll definitely include that in the links. So I wanted to ask you. I want to ask you another question here. Do you think, or do you think, or have you seen this sort of approach being utilized in acting programs in the UK or anywhere in general?
No.
No. Okay.
Quite frankly, sometimes when I look at what people put up about how to play Shakespeare, etc., and sometimes I feel like the guy on the motorway, on the order route, on the highway, the divided highway, motorway we call it in English, who, and my feeling is I've followed the signs. Why is everybody else going the other way? It's, which is a bit of a, I mean, I've had, I've had arguments with people, but because some people can get very heated about what I'm proposing. But what I'm proposing seems to run contradictory to just about what everybody else is proposing. But I'm working simply, purely on the verse. I get very cross when I see people massacring the verse. There's another I think it's a TV film or film of Hamlet, and the "Oh, what a rogue peasant slave am I" is absolutely massacred because he turns it into well, I mean, I don't know how sensitive to language you're, but I mean, it's a masturbation. I mean, it's just, as we would say in English, it's a wank. I mean, it might have felt very good doing it, but oh God.
You're not appreciating the material. You're just going through the motions, basically.
You're not. You're allowing yourself to revel, no, to wallow in the emotions without sharing it with the audience.
That's an interesting point.
I mean, there are two. I mean, I'm not going back to the 1950s and 1960s voice beautiful John Gielgud, an actor whom I absolutely respect and admire, but I mean, there's an apocryphal story about him when he was doing one Shakespeare, and of course he had that magnificent voice, which and so he could get carried away sometimes too, and he sort of, and there's a story when he was delivering one speech, and he came off stage and went, "Oh my God, pure opera." He's criticizing himself. I mean,
Right.
for getting so carried away. But no, I mean, the fascinating thing I found, more and more I look at this, is the more you respect the verse and the more you actually make the verse work for you, the more natural and spontaneous it sounds. Which might seem contradictory to some people given their training, but if you really do respect the verse and really do hit those apparently unimportant words which have fallen on strong beats, it starts to sound much more conversational.
Yeah, because because my and I'm sure this is a general this is like a general way of viewing Shakespeare. It's always been seen as highfalutin and sort of artificial. You know, when people want to go to a Renaissance festival, for instance, everybody puts on the Shakespeare talk, but they kind of forget that Shakespeare is supposed to, it's supposed to be natural, it's supposed to flow, it's supposed to be conversational. So I totally agree with you. You know, Shakespeare. You know, we need to stop having Shakespeare be this artificial kind of something that you put on to sound impressive, and just bring it down to the everyday level. Kind of like with what you were doing back in the day when you were trying to take Shakespeare out to the, to the working class areas and making it accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, one of my treasured memories from that tour was we were in, I mean, literally a working men's club. I mean, they had entertainment, but it would, well, if it was in the States, it would have been a country band. And so, because we could offer it free because we had this grant, they had accepted to have us, and so on. And so after the show, we were taking the set down, and the chairwoman of the works committee came to me and said, "Thank you, I really enjoyed that." And of course, being middle class, snob educated, I asked, of course, I immediately I'd asked the question. I went, "Oh my God, how could you ask that question, you fucking idiot?" And I said, "So did you understand it?" I mean, which is so patronizing, and as I say, I mean, and she said, with her glorious working class accent, "Oh, I didn't understand a word, but I knew exactly what was going on." And I went, "Bless you, lady."
Mission accomplished.
That's exactly what it's all about. You don't need to understand intellectually every single word, but you do need to know what's going on, and that's where the actor comes in.
Oh wow!
And there's one very famous. Well, there's a word, fadge, Fadge, fadge. It occurs twice in the whole of English literature, both times in Shakespeare. Once, it's a wonderful word. I wish I would like to reintroduce it into the English lexicon. I don't know if you know Twelfth Night, but Viola has dressed as a boy, and she's been hired by the Duke to go and woo this rich widow, who he's in love with, but he can't do it because he's the Duke and she's only upper middle class, and so he hires his page, his boy, which is a girl,
Right.
dressed as a boy, to go and woo Olivia on his behalf. And so she does what she's told, she does what she's paid for, and she goes to Olivia and she starts to woo Olivia on behalf of her boss. And then at one point, after one of her meetings with Olivia, Olivia sends her servant to interrupt to get to catch up with Viola, and to give him a ring. And the ring, and she says, "This is the return this ring to your boss." Well, she didn't leave a ring. So this is obviously some sort of subtle message on Olivia's part to say, I kind of fancy you.
Oh, I remember this now. I remember this.
Yeah. And so you've got the wonderful situation where you've got a girl dressed as a boy who goes to woo a woman on behalf of her boss, and the woman starts to fall for the boy
Instead of the boss.
instead of the boss. So her loyalty to her boss is now in question, is now in jeopardy, and also she's got this problem of this woman who is basically coming on to her in no uncertain terms, and she goes, "Oh my God, how will this fudge?" Now, you don't need to go running to a dictionary to look up fudge to figure out what the word fudge means.
I think I can sort of get it from context here.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the only time it's ever used. Well, apart from when Love's Labour's Lost, I think. If this fudge not, we'll have a banquet. He only uses it twice, and nobody else has ever used it anywhere.
Not Marlowe or Ben Jonson or anybody.
No, nor any other writer since in 400 years. But I use it. I use it a lot.
I'm gonna start using that myself now.
Yeah. Well, this isn't going to fudge well, is it?
You and me, Colin, we'll reintroduce into the English language somehow.
Well, yeah, maybe we can get Donald Trump to use it, because he's in a situation which is not going to fudge well. I mentioned the unmentionable. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. You're fine. Colin, I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I do want to be respectful of your time. Now you did mention before we started recording, there was was it a seminar or a program you were gonna do this fall?
Well, there's two projects that I have on in the making. One is I will be running weekly. What I'll do is I would take a speech every week, a different speech, and break it down in the way that I was talking about earlier into the iambic pentameter, the function of the 5 beats, and how, when you respect the iambic pentameter and you look at those 5 beats and you respect what the function of those 5 beats is, you get totally different interpretation of what that speech is about. I keep surprising myself every time I do one. So those will be weekly, and they will probably be on Eventbrite. And then there's the how does a scholar, how does the scholar look at Shakespeare differently from a player, and how does a player look at Shakespeare differently from the scholar, and where can we complement each other instead of being at odds? I mean, I've had conversations with. Are we still recording?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Because I know you mentioned that earlier, about having that that dialogue to see, you know, where the two can sort of reconcile with their understanding of Shakespeare.
Mhm.
Colin, I definitely do
Well,
want to.
I'm going to say something, but can you edit it out?
Well, I mean, I mean, I guess you can mention it after recording.
Okay.
But yeah, I definitely do want to bring you back for future episodes, just because I feel like there's just so much to unpack. And honestly, honestly, this has changed the way I've looked at literature, or Shakespeare, I should say. I know you don't. I know you don't like classifying Shakespeare as literature, so I'll try to be respectful of that. But before we wrap up, are there any particular movies or TV shows or plays that you've seen recently that you want to?
Okay. I'll tell you the story of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet.
Okay.
And my personal um, connection with it. I generally hate, it's generalization, modernizations of classics. You know, if you're going to do La Traviata, then do it in 19th century Paris. You know, don't set it in early 20th century South Africa, for example.
Right.
I mean, there was, and so on. I mean, I just generally hate modernizations of classics, whatever they are. You know,
so Richard III set in a fascist state is not a good idea.
In general, I don't like it. I think because I think in fact, well, there's a there was in 1920s there was a Shakespeare critic who started Shakespeare Society, I think, and he said something which I've always taken to very much to heart. If the director thinks they're bigger than Shakespeare, then they're not aware of their own limitations.
Very true.
And so when you start to set Richard III in a fascist state, or what was it? There was a Hamlet done in Stalinist Russia or something, fairly recently. It starts to become more about the director than the play. And it's, you know, we get the director's vision, and the play becomes secondary to the director's vision. So when the publicity for Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet came out, I went, "Oh God, I'm a great fan of Baz Luhrmann, but you know, oh please, you know." And I was working with a young man at the time, who, and this is some time ago, who turned up at my doorstep with a bottle of whiskey and the VHS, the cassette, of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew me quite well, which is evidenced by the bottle of whiskey. And he said, if you want the bottle of whiskey, you have to watch this. And I went, Kevin, really? And he said, yes. And I went, well, I'm not turning down a bottle of whiskey. So we put the cassette in the machine. We poured ourselves a glass each, and off it went. And within 3 minutes, I was totally hooked. Totally. And I went, wow. And on the back of the box of the VHS, it says Shakespeare has never been this sexy, which I think is an absolute absurd remark, because Shakespeare is always sexy. If if you think it's sexy, it is sexy. If you don't think it's sexy, then you quite simply haven't seen it yet. And I was totally hooked, and right throughout it. And I thought, this is the most truthful to the play version I think I have ever seen. Now, given the visuals, the play was written in 1590 something, and set in Italy in a summer. It takes place over 3 days. Think of that as, but it is the most truthful I have ever seen to the play itself, and it's a play I know extremely well. I probably quote about a quarter of it from memory, and at the end, I was absolutely, at the end, I said, well, thank you for the bottle of whiskey, but thank you for making me see this, because I would never have seen it. I would have refused, given my prejudice.
Right.
And it is prejudice, I admit it. But and then several years later, I was in England. We have charity shops, and people bring things into the shop for people to buy, and the money goes to a charity, Save the Children or Oxfam or whatever. And so I was looking through the DVDs, and I came across the DVD of Romeo and Juliet, and I thought, I don't actually have a copy of it. So I bought it. It's £5 or something, and I brought it home, and I realised there was a making of. There's the DVD of the film itself, and then there's the DVD, a second DVD with all the interviews and some outtakes and other stuff. As they do, as they do with DVDs. And there was an interview with Baz, and about how it came to, about how the film came to be. And so he told the story of, I think it was it after Titanic or before? I think it was after Titanic.
Yeah, Titanic was 97, I believe.
And he was at a party in Hollywood, and there was a big time producer there, and he was talking to him, and DiCaprio came up and joined the conversation, and the big time producer turned around to DiCaprio and said, you got to play Romeo, and you got to direct it. And so I mean, getting any film together, of course, the biggest problem is getting a big time producer on board. And so there you've got the director, the actor, and the big time producer, and the script. The rest is, for filmmakers. Filmmakers will know what that means. I mean, you've overcome 70-80% of the hurdles right on at a party in Hollywood. So a couple of years later, or not that very much long later, the producer called up Baz and said, "Okay, we're ready to go. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, okay, yes, right, fine. Shit, what do I do now?" So in this interview, he said, "Okay, everybody's done Romeo and Juliet. What the hell do I do with it?" And he said, "Okay, there's only one way to approach this, and that is to empty my mind of every Romeo and Juliet I've ever seen, everything, every preconception that I've ever had about the play itself." And he got his secretary to type it up as a film script, not as a not as a literary or text, or as you would find it, but literally in exactly the same way as you would have any other film script presented. And he said, "I locked myself in my office for 3 days and told my secretary to hold all calls, and I just looked at the script, having completely emptied my mind of any other preconceptions, and I just let my imagination go with what came off the page." That's why it works for me, because he didn't come to the project wanting to put his mark on it. He let everything that he put into that film come from the page first.
So he let the script inform the movie, not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I mean, obviously they then had to cut. I mean, certain scenes and certain. I mean, they had to go through probably with a fairly heavy pair of scissors, because. But it's organic. It's even though the setting is not 17th century Verona. What he did is organic, and it's organic because it comes from the script, not because he wanted to do something original.
But it still felt authentic though, because I've seen that movie and it feels authentic, even if it's not set in the, I guess, quote unquote, proper time and place.
Yeah. Well, it's also what he managed to do. I mean, and that's because he's a master filmmaker. He managed to make it everywhere and nowhere. It could be South Africa, it could be Los Angeles, it could be I mean, it's obviously somewhere hot, but it's not actually somewhere. It's not Los Angeles gangs and then making a statement about make Juliet black and Romeo white, and then make a statement about racism, or I mean, or like they did with West Side Story, Puerto Rican versus American, but that was different because they made something inspired by. They did not do Romeo and Juliet. They created a piece of work which was inspired by Romeo and Juliet, but it wasn't pretending to be Romeo and Juliet.
Right. Right.
So yeah, that's and that was, you know, let's see, one of the biggest surprises of my life, that you know, objectively, I would, as I say, I would never have watched it, but I did watch it objectively, except that it was so completely engaging that you just taken into it, you know, right from the beginning, right from that very opening.
I mean, it's also it's also a good example of how you can do Shakespeare right, you know, by making it contemporary, but not, but also being faithful to the story at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, excellent. So Colin, before we wrap up, is there if people are interested in reaching out to you, how can they learn more about your work or get in touch with you?
Well, Shakespeare Unbound .com is a website on which you can buy access to the streaming of the show. ShakespeareUnbound.com.
And you also have a YouTube channel as well.
I have a YouTube channel. I sent you the link to that,
and I'll put that in the description below.
There is also I keep meaning to make it to update it, but the Shakespeare Workshops.blogspot.com, where I talk much more about the workshops.
Okay, I'm just making a note of that now, because like I said, I definitely want to put all that in the description below, because it is a really, really fascinating topic, and it's something that isn't really explored in detail. But I feel like after having this conversation, I'm going to go back and read all the Shakespeare plays now and approach it quite differently, or read it in a very different manner.
I mean, that's part of my crusade, is to, people like reading Shakespeare. I think it's better to watch it, but people like reading Shakespeare. But bear in mind when you read it that it wasn't written to be read, it was written to be performed. So when you read it, try and put yourself in a performer headspace rather than a literary critic headspace.
Yeah, because that's how it was meant to be, originally, anyway.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, as I say, everything was handwritten at the time. So by the time the first night came around, the first performance of, I don't know, Measure for Measure came around, there were only probably three people who had ever seen the entire play. Presumably the author, the book holder, or the stage manager, we would call him now, but the book holder, and the censor. I mean, that's kind of mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of lose sight of that, but I think that's something we definitely need to bring back, along with the word fadge.
And I mean, by the time the folio up until the time when the folio was printed, there was probably only one copy, handwritten, of that play in existence.
Wow.
And in fact, in the play Shakespeare Unbound, I kind of suggest that in fact there wasn't any copy of the entire play, because some of the prompt books would have been lost in the fire in 1613. So in order to put the plays together, John Hemmings and Henry Condell would probably have had to go around the actors, the players, and say, look, can you give me your copy, your cue script for Taming of the Shrew, Measure for Measure, etc., because we want to print the plays and we don't have a full copy. So, those cue scripts would have been in the possession of the players, and therefore not, fortunately, in the in the theatre when it burnt down, the Globe, and so reconstructed the plays from the cue scripts. It's something it's a conjecture on my part, but it's more than possible.
I mean, it kind of makes sense when you think about it, based on what we've discussed today. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the episode, but remember to like, comment, subscribe, and let us know what you think about Shakespeare. Let us know what your favorite plays are, and hopefully, Colin, we'll get you back for future episodes.
Be more than happy to.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for watching, and have a great day.
Okay. Bye.